The Gunslinger's Ward. The desert wind carried the scent of death and dry earth as Jake Thornton rode into Salvation Creek just as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks. His weathered face, marked by years of sun and sorrow, showed no emotion as he guided his black stallion down the dusty main street. The town was smaller than most, barely more than a collection of wooden buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness of the Arizona Territory. Jake had been riding alone for nigh on 15 years now, ever since that terrible day in Tombstone when everything he'd held dear had been torn away by bullets and betrayal. He was a man of few words and fewer friends, making his living as a hired gun for those who could afford his particular set of skills. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. Jake Thornton, the man who never missed, never hesitated, and never looked back. But something about this particular evening felt different. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to whisper secrets, or how the very air seemed thick with unspoken dread. As he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the Dusty Rose Saloon, Jake noticed how quiet the streets were. Too quiet for a town this size, even at supper time. The saloon doors swung open with their familiar creak, and Jake stepped inside to find the usual collection of miners, drifters, and local folk nursing their whiskey and avoiding eye contact. He ordered a bottle of rye and found himself a corner table where he could keep his back to the wall and his eyes on the room. It was then that he overheard the conversation that would change everything. "I tell you, Martha Cleary's gone too far this time," whispered a portly man in a checkered vest to his companion, locking that poor girl up like she was some kind of wild animal. "Hush your mouth, Earl," the other man replied nervously. "You know what happened to the last fella who spoke ill of Martha's ways. Found him face down in the creek with his skull caved in. But that child ain't done nothing wrong except see things before they happen. My Mary says the girl predicted old Henderson's death 3 days before his heart gave out. And she warned about that mine collapse last month, saved a dozen lives." Jake's interest was piqued despite himself. He'd known his share of folks who claimed to see the future, most of them charlatans looking to make a quick dollar. But the fear in these men's voices suggested something more serious was at play. "Where's she keeping the girl?" Jake found himself asking, his deep voice cutting through their whispered conversation. Both men turned to look at him, their faces going pale when they recognized the legendary gunslinger. Earl swallowed hard before answering. "Out at the old Cleary place, about 2 miles north of town. But mister, I'd advise against getting involved. Martha's got herself a small army of hired guns, and she don't take kindly to strangers poking around her business." Jake nodded and returned to his drink, but his mind was racing. He'd encountered plenty of evil in his time, men who killed for money, for pleasure, or for the simple joy of watching others suffer. But there was something particularly vile about anyone who would torment a child, especially one whose only crime seemed to be possessing an unusual gift. As the evening wore on, Jake learned more about the situation from the loose-tongued locals. The girl's name was Sarah, and she was Martha Cleary's own niece, orphaned when her parents died in a cholera outbreak 2 years prior. At first, Martha had seemed like a godsend, taking in the child when no one else would. But as Sarah's visions became more frequent and accurate, Martha had grown increasingly disturbed by what she called the devil's work, started locking her in the cellar during the day. Earl had confided when the whiskey loosened his tongue further. Then it was the barn. But last week Martha went and had a pine box made, a proper coffin, and that's where she's been keeping the poor child. Says it'll teach her to stop seeing things that ain't meant to be seen. The very thought of it made Jake's blood run cold. He'd seen plenty of cruelty in his years, but this was beyond the pale. A 16-year-old girl locked in a coffin like she was already dead, all because she possessed a gift that frightened her guardian. Jake finished his bottle and stood up, his hand instinctively checking the twin Colt .45s at his hips. He'd made his decision. Consequences be damned. The ride to the Cleary place took him through terrain that grew increasingly desolate as he moved away from town. The moon was full, casting eerie shadows across the landscape of sagebrush and scattered rocks. The house itself was a substantial 2-story structure, clearly built by someone with money and pretensions. Several smaller buildings dotted the property, including a large barn and what looked like a bunkhouse for hired help. Jake counted at least 6 horses tied up near the main house, confirming what he'd heard about Martha's security arrangements. He circled the property once, noting the positions of the guards he could see and planning his approach. Violence would likely be unavoidable, but he preferred to minimize it when possible. It was as he completed his reconnaissance that he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the night wind. It was singing, a girl's voice raised in a melody that seemed to drift from somewhere behind the main house. The voice was sweet, but tinged with a sadness that cut through Jake's carefully constructed emotional armor like a knife through paper. Following the sound, he discovered a small outbuilding set apart from the others. Unlike the rest of the structures, this one had no windows and only one door, which was secured with a heavy chain and padlock. The singing was coming from inside. Jake approached carefully, keeping to the shadows and watching for guards. When he was certain he was alone, he moved closer to the building and pressed his ear against the wooden wall. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. "That saved a wretch like me," came the girl's voice, trembling but determined. "I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see." The irony of the song choice wasn't lost on Jake. Here was a girl who could see the future, locked away by someone who insisted she was blind to God's will. He'd heard enough. Moving to the door, he examined the lock. It was sturdy, but not impossible to break with the right tools. "Who's there?" came the girl's voice from inside, no longer singing. "I can hear you breathing." Jake paused, unsure how to respond. He wasn't accustomed to dealing with children, and certainly not under circumstances like these. "My name's Jake," he said finally, keeping his voice low. "I heard about your situation in town. I'm here to help." There was a long silence before she spoke again. "Are you one of Aunt Martha's men?" "No, miss. I'm nobody's man but my own, and I don't cotton to folks who lock children in boxes." Another pause, then, "I saw you coming. In a vision, I mean. You're the gunslinger with the broken heart and the black horse. You've come to take me away from here." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He'd encountered his share of fortune-tellers and mystics in border towns from here to Mexico, but there was something different about this girl's voice, a certainty that suggested her gift was genuine. "Can you see what happens next?" he asked. "There's going to be shooting," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "Men will die tonight, but not you and not me. You're going to keep me safe." Before Jake could respond, he heard the sound of approaching footsteps and voices. Moving quickly away from the building, he found cover behind a pile of lumber and waited. "Thought I heard voices over by the girl's box," one of the guards was saying as they approached. "Better check on her." "Martha said not to bother her, except for water and bread," replied his companion. "Girl's probably just talking to herself. Gets a mite strange when you're locked up that long." "Well, we better take a look just the same. Boss lady don't pay us to take chances." Jake watched as the two men approached the building where Sarah was imprisoned. They were both armed and alert, but they weren't expecting trouble. That would be their mistake. Moving silently, Jake circled around behind them. Years of experience had taught him how to move without making a sound, even across ground littered with debris. When he was close enough, he struck. The first guard went down without a sound, Jake's arm wrapping around his throat and cutting off his air supply until he lost consciousness. The second man started to turn, his hand moving toward his gun, but Jake was faster. A swift blow to the base of the skull dropped him to the ground beside his partner. Jake quickly dragged both unconscious men into the shadows, then returned to the building where Sarah was being held. The lock proved more stubborn than he'd hoped, but a few strategic strikes with the butt of his pistol broke the chain. The door swung open to reveal a sight that made Jake's jaw clench with rage. The building was barely large enough to hold the pine coffin that sat in its center, and that coffin was clearly occupied. The lid was propped open just enough to allow air to circulate, but the space inside was so cramped that the girl would barely be able to move. "Sarah," Jake called softly. "I'm here," came the reply, and slowly the coffin lid opened wider. The girl who emerged was thin and pale, her long auburn hair tangled and dirty. Her clothes, once probably a simple dress, were now little more than rags. But her eyes were the most striking thing about her. They were the color of deep forest green, and they seemed to hold knowledge far beyond her 16 years. "You're taller than I saw in my vision," she said as she climbed out of the coffin, her movements stiff from confinement. "And your eyes are sadder." Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he focused on the practical. "Can you ride?" "I used to before," she gestured vaguely at the coffin. "I think I remember how." "Good. We need to get you out of here before." The sound of shouting from the main house cut him off. Their escape had been discovered, probably when the guards failed to report in. Jake could see lights moving in the windows and hear Martha Cleary's voice raised in anger. "Find them," she was screaming. "Find them and bring me that devil child back." Jake took Sarah's hand, noting how cold and thin it was. "Can you run?" She nodded, and together they made their way through the darkness toward where Jake had left his horse. Behind them, the Cleary property was coming alive with armed men and blazing torches. Jake knew they had maybe minutes before the search would reach them. His black stallion, trained for situations like this, stood calmly, despite the growing commotion. Jake boosted Sarah up behind him, then swung into the saddle himself. "Hold on tight," he told her, and spurred the horse into motion. They rode hard through the night, putting distance between themselves and Martha Cleary's vengeance. Jake knew these trails well enough to navigate by moonlight, and his horse was sure-footed even in the darkness. Behind them, he could hear the sounds of pursuit, men shouting, horses' hooves pounding the hard earth.
"They're going to catch us," Sarah said suddenly, her voice calm despite the circumstances. "No, they won't," Jake replied grimly. "I know every canyon and creek bed for 50 miles. We'll lose them in the Badlands." "I can see it," she insisted. "We're going to have to fight. Soon." As if summoned by her words, the crack of rifle fire split the night air. A bullet whined past Jake's ear, close enough that he could feel the heat of its passage. "Down," he shouted, and Sarah pressed herself against his back as he urged the horse into a zigzag pattern to make them a harder target. More shots followed, some uncomfortably close. Jake could see the muzzle flashes behind them, maybe a dozen riders in pursuit. Martha Cleary had indeed assembled herself a small army, and they were all determined to bring Sarah back. The canyon Jake was heading for was still a quarter-mile away, and their pursuers were gaining ground. He made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who didn't know his reputation. Pulling up short, Jake swung down from the saddle and handed the reins to Sarah. "Keep riding straight for that dark opening in the rocks," he told her, pointing toward the canyon mouth. "Don't look back, no matter what you hear." "But you can't fight them all alone," Sarah protested. "Watch me," Jake replied, and there was something in his voice that made her believe him despite the impossible odds. As Sarah rode toward safety, Jake took position behind a large boulder and drew his guns. 12 men against one might seem like terrible odds to most folks, but Jake Thornton wasn't most folks. He was a man who had survived 15 years as a gunfighter by being faster, smarter, and more ruthless than anyone who tried to kill him. The first riders came into range, and Jake's Colts began their deadly work. His first two shots dropped the lead riders from their saddles. The third shot took out a man who was trying to circle around for a flanking position. By the time the surviving gunmen realized what they were up against, half their number was already down. "It's Jake Thornton," one of them shouted. "The girl ain't worth dying for." But Martha Cleary's voice cut through the night like a whip. "$10,000 to the man who brings me that child, and $1,000 for Thornton's head." Money changed everything. Suddenly, the surviving gunmen were willing to risk their lives for a chance at that reward. They spread out, trying to surround Jake's position, but he was already moving. Years of experience had taught him never to stay in one place too long during a firefight. The battle that followed was brutal and brief. Jake moved like a ghost through the rocks and sagebrush, his guns speaking with deadly precision. When it was over, 9 men lay dead on the desert floor, and the 3 survivors were riding hard back toward town, their appetite for Martha Cleary's money considerably diminished. Jake reloaded his guns and walked back to where he'd left his horse. Sarah was waiting for him at the canyon mouth, her face pale but determined. "I told you to keep riding," he said as he swung back into the saddle. "I saw you win," she replied simply. "I knew you'd be all right." They rode through the night and into the next day, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Salvation Creek. Jake knew that Martha Cleary wouldn't give up easily. Not with her reputation and $10,000 at stake. They would need to get far away, somewhere she couldn't reach them. As they traveled, Jake found himself studying his unlikely companion. Despite everything she'd been through, Sarah showed a resilience that impressed him. She didn't complain about the hard riding or ask for frequent stops. When they did pause to rest the horse and eat some of Jake's trail provisions, she was curious about everything. The countryside, his horse, even his guns. "You killed those men to save me," she said during one of their stops, her voice thoughtful rather than accusatory. "They made their choice," Jake replied. "Could have ridden away when they had the chance." "Have you killed many people?" It was a direct question, the kind most folks were too polite or too scared to ask. Jake considered how to answer it. "More than I should have," he said finally, "but all of them deserved it." Sarah nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her. "I can see the darkness in you," she said, "but there's light too. More light than you think." Jake wasn't sure what to make of that. He'd never thought of himself as having any light left, not after all the things he'd done and seen. But there was something about this girl that made him want to believe her. They rode for 3 days, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Jake was heading for a place he'd heard about but never seen, a settlement called Haven Valley, tucked away in the mountains where folks minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about a person's past. On the third night, as they sat around a small campfire and shared a can of beans, Sarah suddenly stiffened and stared into the darkness. "What is it?" Jake asked, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "I see a town," she said, her voice taking on the dreamy quality it had when her visions came. "A place where people help each other instead of hurting. You're going to build something there, something good, and I'm going to help you." "Sarah, I ain't the building type," Jake said gently. "I'm a gunfighter. It's all I know how to do." She turned to look at him, and in the firelight her eyes seemed to glow with inner knowledge. "No," she said firmly, "you were a gunfighter. But that's not who you are anymore. I can see your future, Jake Thornton, and it's brighter than you think." The next morning brought them to the ridge overlooking Haven Valley, and Jake had to admit it was one of the most beautiful sights he'd ever seen. The valley was green and fertile, with a clear stream running through its center, and mountains rising protectively on all sides. The town itself was small but well maintained, with neat wooden buildings and gardens that spoke of people who cared about their community. "This is it," Sarah said with certainty. "This is where we're supposed to be." As they rode down into the valley, Jake found himself thinking about the girl's words. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time for him to stop running from his past and start building something for the future. It wouldn't be easy. He had no experience being anything other than a gun for hire. But with Sarah's visions to guide them and her unshakable faith in his ability to change, perhaps anything was possible. The townspeople of Haven Valley proved to be as welcoming as their community appeared. They asked few questions about Jake and Sarah's past, accepting instead the story that she was his ward and that they were looking for a place to settle down. The town was in need of a sheriff, and despite his reputation, or perhaps because of it, they offered Jake the position. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but as the months passed, Jake found himself growing into the role. He kept the peace with a firm but fair hand, and his reputation was enough to deter most troublemakers from testing Haven Valley's hospitality. Sarah proved equally valuable to the community, using her gift to help prevent accidents and warn of dangerous weather. Martha Cleary never did find them, though word reached Haven Valley that she'd eventually been arrested for the murder of a traveling preacher who'd spoken out against her treatment of Sarah. Justice, it seemed, had found her in the end. As for Jake and Sarah, they built the life she had foreseen in her vision, a life of purpose and meaning in a place where both of them could finally belong. The lonely gunslinger had found his redemption, and the girl with the gift of sight had found someone who would never lock her away for being who she was meant to be. Years later, when Jake was an old man with silver in his hair, and Sarah was a grown woman with children of her own, people would still tell the story of how the legendary gunfighter gave up his violent ways to save a girl trapped in a coffin. But those who knew them best understood the truth, that they had saved each other and in doing so, had found something more valuable than all the gold in the territory, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of love.